I moved into the Rivercrest Landing community with my wife, Fiona, and our 12-year-old son, Oliver, barely 6 months ago. We were enchanted by the neighborhood's well-maintained lawns, quiet streets, and family-friendly ambience. The homes nestled along a scenic bend in the Willow Bend River, forming an affluent suburban area just outside a medium-sized city in the American Midwest. I'd spent most of my adult life in various coastal regions, first training and eventually serving as a Maritime Rescue Commander in the Coast Guard, though none of the neighbors realized my career credentials at the time. When I retired, I thought I was leaving behind the stress and unpredictability of rescue operations. Little did I know the local homeowners association, HOA, would be an even more formidable adversary. From the very beginning, we were introduced to a woman known by two names, Brenda Armitage, the official moniker, though she was more commonly whispered about under the nickname Karen. She was in her 50s, with a stiff posture that seemed to exude disapproval. A slender woman with meticulously styled short hair, she always wore knee-length skirts and crisp blouses, never failing to flaunt that she chaired the HOA board. She greeted us with a forced politeness, offering a plastic smile as she handed us a 3-inch thick book of rules and regulations for our new home. "Welcome to Rivercrest Landing," she said, glancing at my unkempt front shrubs. "We pride ourselves on maintaining very high standards. I trust you'll do the same." I nodded and thanked her, though there was something unsettling in how her eyes narrowed behind her wire-rimmed glasses. She was the type to notice the smallest infraction, an overgrown weed or a trash can left on the curb 5 minutes too long, and promptly send a formal complaint letter. For the first few weeks, we played along. I trimmed the bushes to uniform shapes, paid the HOA fees on time, and tried not to make waves. But living under Karen's watchful gaze quickly became a daily stress, and I soon found myself longing for the rough seas and storms of my previous career rather than the shallow social battles that erupted on these pristine sidewalks. Things escalated after the first HOA meeting I attended. I learned, in dismay, that Karen had effectively appointed herself the architectural compliance czar, among other made-up roles, granting herself power to police every detail of the community. Her arrogance was matched only by her appetite for control. When my wife proposed adding a small herb garden to our front yard, Karen almost leapt out of her seat in protest. "That's not aesthetically consistent with the rest of the neighborhood," she announced, as though we'd just threatened to demolish our house. "We have rules in place, so our landscaping meets a certain standard." "But it's just a small garden," Fiona replied, her voice calm. "And it'd look quite pretty, plus it's practical." Karen's thin lips tightened. "That's not how we do things here. We have a uniform front lawn policy, mostly grass, ornamental bushes, or standard annual flowers. If we let one person change it to a vegetable or herb garden, then the entire neighborhood would devolve into chaos." As she spoke, she cut her hand through the air, an imperious motion that seemed to slash down any opposition. A few of the HOA board members winced or averted their gazes, but no one openly challenged her. Clearly, we had walked into her kingdom. Despite the friction, Fiona and I decided it wasn't worth the fight. We let the matter drop and tried to stay under the radar. Yet, I had the suspicion that no matter how compliant we were, Karen would continue to find ways to harass us and the rest of the residents. And I was right. Over the ensuing months, minor neighborly annoyances ballooned into intense conflicts, most of which circled back to Karen's meddling. As the weeks rolled on, however, a far more pressing concern emerged. The Willow Bend River's water levels were climbing, and meteorologists warned that an unusually severe rainy season could overflow the river's banks, posing a flood risk to our community. While some of the older residents assured us that the neighborhood had never experienced more than minor flooding, I recognized the warning signs of a potentially major disaster. My years in maritime and coastal rescue had taught me to never underestimate water's power, and so I began quietly advocating for precautionary measures. Little did I know, it was precisely my background, my specialized knowledge of flood and maritime rescue, that would eventually unravel Karen's terrifying sabotage of our community's safety plan. The upcoming rainy season had many neighbors on edge. Several residents petitioned the HOA board to fund a comprehensive flood preparedness plan. We wanted evacuation routes, designated assembly points, and maybe even a stash of emergency supplies. Given our proximity to the river, it seemed like common sense. The next board meeting was packed with anxious homeowners. Karen sat at the head of a long oak table, a set of thick binders and official documents spread out in front of her. Beside her sat the HOA's secretary, a timid man named Ronald, who was in charge of typing up meeting minutes. A few other board members, each seemingly overshadowed by Karen, sat in stiff chairs, waiting for her to open the meeting. The tension in the room felt palpable. "Ladies and gentlemen," Karen began, "I understand there are concerns about the possibility of flooding." She paused, letting her gaze travel over everyone gathered. "I want to assure you that the HOA has everything under control." At that moment, I spoke up. I typically try not to challenge people openly in these settings, at least not without good cause, but I felt we had reached that point. "Can you elaborate on the measures being taken?" Karen's eyes snapped to me with that all-too-familiar narrow stare. "Yes, of course. We have sandbags stored in the community maintenance shed, and we intend to distribute them should the need arise." "Are there any evacuation plans?" I asked, not missing a beat. "Any designated safe zones or coordination with local emergency services?" She pursed her lips again. "We have guidelines in the HOA handbook, and if there's a crisis, 911 is always available." I tried not to let my frustration show. The standard homeowner's manual was hardly sufficient for a potential large-scale flood. "I'm a retired Maritime Rescue Commander," I explained calmly. "And if you'd like, I can coordinate with local emergency resources. We could set up community training sessions for proper use of rescue equipment, how to board an evacuation vessel safely, and so on." Karen looked at me with suspicion, as though I were making an outlandish request. Our community has never needed such dramatic measures. She was clearly trying to downplay my expertise. But as the meeting progressed, I realized many of the neighbors agreed with me. A man named Julius, who lived a few streets over, recounted a local news report that predicted the Willowbend River might breach its banks for the first time in 30 years. An older woman named Clara chimed in, expressing her worry about how she'd evacuate if the roads flooded. Karen cleared her throat to silence them. "While I appreciate the concerns," she said, "we have a budget to consider, and the board can't allocate thousands of dollars to hypothetical emergencies." The tension grew. The atmosphere felt thick with unspoken resentment. Residents were pushing for real solutions. Karen was stonewalling every idea that wasn't hers. Despite her interference, momentum had built for at least minimal action. A few of us formed an informal committee to plan a safer evacuation protocol, and Karen grudgingly allowed it, with the condition that we'd be responsible for our own funding unless the board voted otherwise. Thus began our neighbor-led plan to secure small, inflatable rescue boats and train volunteers in basic flood evacuation techniques. Julius helped coordinate with a local sporting goods store for discounted life vests. Clara offered her garage as a storage site for the volunteer group's equipment. Ronald even quietly gave me an old blueprint of the neighborhood drainage systems so we could plan evacuation routes that circumvented the most flood-prone streets. Even if Karen barely tolerated our efforts, for a while it felt like the community was coming together. Yet in the shadows, jealousy and arrogance festered. Karen despised the fact that a grassroots effort had mobilized without her exclusive oversight. She insisted on micromanaging, from the color of the life vests to the exact hours we could store equipment in the common garages. She started sending out bizarre bulletins, disclaimers, and veiled threats of fines if unauthorized equipment was left on common property for any length of time beyond reason. It was clear she was trying to sabotage us through technicalities. We pressed on, ignoring the petty obstacles. The warnings about heavy rainfall had grown more frequent, and we had no time for petty politics. Yet, if we thought her efforts at sabotage would remain small, we had another thing coming. Karen was about to do something unthinkably reckless. Late September brought an unrelenting downpour. Day after day, black clouds swirled above, and the Willowbend River rose inch by inch. Most of us in the new volunteer group, the River Crest Rescue Team, we jokingly called ourselves, kept careful watch. Through local news bulletins and official weather reports, we learned that a tropical storm had pushed inland, dumping massive amounts of rain throughout the region. Nearby towns reported flash flooding. By the time the water level reached the underside of the old wooden footbridge near our community, it was clear we were in for a potential catastrophe. I saw it in the neighbors' eyes. The same tension, the same dread. Entire families started moving valuables into second-story rooms. People parked cars in higher elevation spots, away from the roads known to accumulate water. Clara told me she spent hours each day scooping debris out of the storm drains, hoping that would at least slow the flooding. Julius was in contact with some local emergency management officials, trying to coordinate if the worst hit. What was Karen doing while the rest of us worked diligently to prevent a disaster? She organized an event called Rivercrest Pride Day, instructing homeowners to come outside and tidy their lawns, plant new shrubs, and repaint fences. When I questioned the timing of such an event during near-constant rain, she responded with a dismissive wave. We can't let a little weather keep us from upholding our neighborhood standards. Her bizarre focus on appearances during a legitimate emergency left many of us baffled. I considered that maybe she was in denial, or perhaps she believed that ignoring the flood risk would somehow make it go away. But as the rainfall intensified and thunder rattled the windows at night, a new hypothesis formed in my mind. Maybe Karen just didn't like not being in control. In the midst of the rising tension, the Rivercrest rescue team decided we needed a final check on the actual evacuation equipment. We'd pooled resources to purchase 5 large inflatable boats, each capable of holding 8 to 10 people. These were not cheap. They were professional grade, akin to rescue dinghies, with reinforced exteriors and compartments for emergency supplies. We planned to station them around the neighborhood in strategic spots, ready to be deployed if the roads became impassable. One late afternoon, after the torrential rain paused briefly, Julius and I held an inspection in Clara's garage. All 5 boats were lined up, fully inflated, the electric pumps still plugged in. We tested each one's compartments, verifying that the patches were secure and that no slow leaks developed. Everything seemed in order. We even tested the outboard motors we'd acquired, small ones, but enough thrust to move through flooded streets. I remember patting Julius on the back and remarking, "If we have to use these, I know we'll be saving lives." He nodded grimly. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that, but at least we're prepared." From the corner of the garage, Ronald gave a cautious smile. "Karen's not going to like this one bit. She'll say the boats are unsightly or some nonsense." Clara let out a wry laugh. "I already caught her lurking outside my driveway this morning, peering in. She didn't say anything, just stood there. It gave me the creeps." We all shared concerned glances, but we tried to shake it off. We had done nothing wrong, nothing but try to protect our neighbors from a looming disaster. None of us could have guessed how far she would go to keep her thumb on this community. Heavy rain battered the rooftops through the night. In the early hours of the morning, maybe around 2 a.m., my phone buzzed with an urgent call. Julius's voice, panicked and out of breath, crackled through the speaker. "You need to get to Clara's place, quick. Something's happened to the boats." Instantly, adrenaline surged through me. I flung on rain gear and dashed to my SUV. The ride through the dark, waterlogged streets felt surreal. Lightning illuminated the sky, revealing the river raging over the usual banks, creeping toward the main road. Pools of standing water made the drive treacherous, but I pressed forward, finally arriving at Clara's driveway. I found Julius and Clara huddled beneath the awning of her garage. The door was open, and I spotted the 5 inflatable boats inside, except they were in disarray. At least 2 lay partially deflated, and the others looked tampered with. My heart sank. "Someone slashed them," Julius said, pointing to a pair of neat, surgical cuts on the side of the nearest boat. "And that's not all." He guided me to the outboard motors lined up on a workbench, each motor in a sorry state, wires pulled out or parts unscrewed. As I bent down to inspect the damage, Clara's voice trembled. "This is going to cost thousands to repair or replace." She shook her head. Who would do such a thing? Given recent events, a single name popped into my mind: Karen. Still, it seemed inconceivable that she would stoop this low, risking people's safety and property in the midst of an impending flood. All for what? Control? Spite? An ego-driven vendetta? But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. She had made her hostility to the rescue preparations plain. She had plenty of opportunity to snoop around, and she sure had the arrogance to believe she could get away with it. Not wanting to jump to conclusions prematurely, I examined the damage more thoroughly. The slash marks were indeed precise, as though done with a box cutter or a similar sharp knife. The motors showed deliberate sabotage, with crucial components yanked. It wasn't random vandalism. It was targeted, likely by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, or at least had instructions. "We need to call the police," I said. Julius and Clara agreed. With the storm raging, the police response might be delayed, but we filed a report anyway. Despite the heartbreak, we tried to salvage what we could. We reinflated one boat that only had minor cuts, applying a patch kit. It held pressure for a while. The motors, though, were going to take days to fix, and we might not have that much time. Water levels were rising fast. Without all 5 boats, we lost valuable evacuation capacity. As dawn broke, the gravity of the situation hit us like a punch in the gut. This wasn't just petty neighborhood drama. People's lives could be at stake if the floodwaters came roaring in. Anger and disbelief boiled in my chest. I wanted answers. I wanted justice. But most of all, I wanted to ensure that no one in this community or the adjacent neighborhoods drowned because some pompous HOA tyrant couldn't tolerate a rescue effort that she didn't orchestrate. The next move had to be carefully planned. We needed evidence, and we needed solutions, fast. I spent that morning going door to door, updating our volunteer group. Clara let people know about the sabotage. We encouraged everyone to remain calm, but also to stay vigilant. If someone was brazen enough to break into a garage and slash rescue boats, who knew what else they might do? "Keep your eyes peeled," I told a neighbor named Susan, who lived across the street from Clara. "And if you happen to have any security footage, let me know." She immediately perked up. "My husband installed new cameras last week to watch our driveway. They might have caught something last night." That was the first ray of hope. Susan's husband, Dennis, showed me the footage. Sure enough, around 1 a.m., a figure holding an umbrella and wearing a dark raincoat slipped across the street toward Clara's house. The lighting was poor, the angle was distant, and the person had their hood up, so it was impossible to make a positive ID. But the height, build, and posture suggested a woman. The footage also captured the moment the figure hurried away, scurrying down the sidewalk with a bundle under one arm. While the image wasn't crystal clear, it seemed to confirm that the sabotage was no mere rumor or assumption. Someone had indeed infiltrated Clara's garage, and the silhouette could very well match Karen's. I knew I needed more. Another neighbor, Mark, had a camera angled at the intersection. His footage captured part of the street about half a block away. It was similarly grainy, but it seemed to show the same figure, though from behind, disappearing around the corner that led directly to Karen's house. I felt a pit in my stomach. This was practically enough evidence for me to ring Karen's doorbell and confront her, but I knew better. If I stormed over to her, she'd likely deny everything, or worse, try to spin a story that we were framing her. Instead, I compiled the footage and gave a copy to the investigating officer who arrived late that afternoon. The officer, a polite but understandably harried man, promised to open a case. However, with the flooding emergency looming, law enforcement resources were stretched thin. "You might want to consider hiring a private security firm," he suggested, "if you're worried about more sabotage." We didn't have the funds for that, obviously. Our best bet was to keep a 24-hour watch on the last partially intact boat and coordinate with the local emergency management office for more robust help. Julius got on the phone with them, explaining that we had a sabotage situation. They sympathized, but there was no immediate solution. Official rescue teams were already strained by the storm. To make matters worse, the forecast had changed. Severe rainfall was expected for at least 2 more days, with the potential for the Willowbend River to crest at record levels. The sense of urgency was palpable. Amid these developments, Karen was conspicuously absent from the usual HOA interactions. She didn't send emails, didn't post new bulletins, didn't come outside for her typical neighborly patrols. A part of me wondered if she was having second thoughts, if she was afraid of being caught. Or maybe she was smug, certain that she'd covered her tracks well enough. 2 nights later, Clara told me she spotted Karen near the maintenance shed, rummaging around in the HOA's official supply of sandbags. That was suspicious, but not necessarily incriminating. Anyone might need sandbags. However, it fueled our belief that Karen was definitely active under the radar, and that her motivations might not align with the community's welfare. While all this was happening, I couldn't help but reflect on my past experiences as a Maritime Rescue Commander. On ocean rescues, I'd always known the chain of command, the standard protocols, the resources at my disposal. If sabotage happened, like pirates tampering with a vessel or a competitor messing with another ship, it was swiftly investigated by the authorities. Here, though, this was suburban America, and ironically, it felt more chaotic and lawless than the high seas. We were effectively on our own. The day the Willowbend River flooded into our streets was harrowing. It began at around 3 a.m., with a distant roar of water that woke half the neighborhood. By dawn, sections of the main road were submerged under 2 feet of dark, swirling water. Cars struggled to navigate. Some folks who lived in the lower-lying streets found water lapping at their driveways, creeping into their garages. A full-scale evacuation wasn't officially announced, but the county emergency alert system urged residents near the river to consider relocating to higher ground. Our volunteer group tried to mobilize what remained of our equipment. One of the sabotage-slashed boats had been repaired enough to be functional, so we put that into the water near the front of the subdivision. The other 4 were out of commission, 2 with irreparable tears, and the other 2 lacking usable motors. Still, we had that single boat plus the partial help of a second, if we used oars or paddles. It wasn't ideal, but it was something. As the water continued to rise, I found myself slipping back into my rescue commander mindset, giving directions to volunteers and coordinating with frantic neighbors. Julius and I launched the boat around midday, heading down the flooded street to pick up an elderly couple trapped in their single-story home. We managed to ferry them, and their cat, back to higher ground. Seeing the gratitude and relief in their eyes made all our stress worthwhile. By mid-afternoon, an official rescue team arrived from the city, bringing a few swiftwater rescue rafts. They began evacuating families from the worst-hit areas. In a surprising twist, local news crews also arrived, setting up cameras near the edge of the flood zone to capture the heroic efforts. Suddenly, the entire region's attention was on Rivercrest Landing. I was waist-deep in water, guiding the rescue boat with a rope, when a reporter approached, microphone in hand. "We're told you're coordinating a community-led rescue effort. Can you tell us what's going on?" Half-soaked, I spoke about how the neighborhood prepared ahead of time, despite certain obstacles, and that we were working alongside official emergency services. I chose my words carefully, not wanting to air all our dirty laundry. Still, I felt compelled to add, it's crucial for communities to come together in times like these. Preparedness saves lives. To my shock, a short while later, who should appear on camera but Karen herself. She must have been watching from her second-floor balcony or somewhere close by. She appeared with a stoic expression, clad in a bright yellow raincoat. The reporter pivoted toward her. "And you are?" "Brenda Armitage," Karen announced, her voice suddenly adopting a gentle, concerned tone. "I'm the head of the HOA here. We've made every effort to keep this community safe, allocating sandbags, reinforcing the levees, and ensuring that any rescue equipment is properly authorized." I nearly choked on my anger. She was spinning the story, painting herself as a diligent leader. The camera panned back to me, perhaps sensing tension, but I forced myself to remain calm. This was not the time to have a screaming match on live TV. People's homes were underwater. We had bigger problems. Even so, I knew I couldn't let her false narrative stand unchallenged forever. And as it turned out, the consequences of her sabotage were about to make themselves painfully evident in front of the entire neighborhood. Late that evening, when the initial shock of the flood had calmed down, the city rescue teams and volunteers convened on a dry stretch of road near the community entrance. Trucks filled with supplies and additional sandbags lined the curb. A group of local police officers stood near their cruiser, coordinating with emergency management staff. I noticed an older policeman, the one who had taken my earlier statement about the vandalism to our boats. He recognized me immediately. "Hey," he said, "we got a partial ID from some more security footage. You might want to take a look." He showed me a still photo taken from a camera on the next street over. The figure with the umbrella and raincoat was partially illuminated by a streetlight, enough to see a distinctive pattern on the coat sleeve. It looked suspiciously like the swirling embroidered pattern I'd seen on Karen's raincoat earlier that day. "That's definitely her," I muttered. The policeman nodded grimly. With that new piece of evidence, they had enough to bring Karen in for questioning. At that moment, an authoritative voice barked over the walkie-talkie that the flooding was rising, and some civilians needed immediate evacuation from further upriver. I wanted to see Karen confronted, but rescuing people took precedence. I told the officer to do what he needed to do. While we were both scanning the chaotic scene, the policeman spotted a woman in a bright yellow coat near the perimeter. "That her?" he asked. It was Karen, of course, likely eavesdropping on the official rescue instructions. The policeman strode over, accompanied by another officer. I saw them engage her in conversation. She raised her hands in protest, shook her head vehemently, and then tried to walk away. One of the officers stepped in front of her to block her path. Even from a distance, it was clear that this was more than a polite request. She was being questioned about serious wrongdoing. A flash of lightning ripped the sky, momentarily illuminating the cluster of houses behind them. The next instant, a shrieking alarm echoed from the direction of the communal maintenance shed. One of the rescue team members rushed toward us, shouting, "Someone tampered with the sandbag pallets. They're all falling over." In the swirling mess of the flood, it was easy for saboteurs to cause more chaos. But it seemed we had caught the culprit before she could flee. Karen's arrogance had done her no favors this time. If I had any lingering doubt, it disappeared when I saw the policeman retrieve a small utility knife from Karen's coat pocket. The silver blade glinted under the streetlights. She clutched it protectively, as though it were the last piece of her carefully built facade. I expected her to deny everything. And indeed, at first, she did. She ranted about how she was protecting the community from vigilantes. She insisted she had only used the knife to cut rope from a snagged sandbag. She played the victim, claiming we were turning the neighborhood into a paramilitary zone. But her rants fell on deaf ears. The security footage, the consistent timeline, and the eyewitness accounts from that night in Clara's garage formed a damning case. Within minutes, the policeman signaled for backup, and Karen was gently but firmly placed into handcuffs. A hush fell over the neighbors who had gathered, some of them waist-deep in water. It was a surreal sight. The tyrannical HOA queen, undone by her own sabotage, standing drenched in the flood she had tried to exploit for her own twisted sense of control. As rescue efforts continued around the clock, Karen's arrest sent shockwaves through Rivercrest Landing. Rumors flew about how she'd go to any length to assert dominance, even putting lives at risk. The final straw for many was hearing about her infiltration of the maintenance shed, toppling crucial sandbags, and further jeopardizing the flood defenses. An official police statement emerged indicating that Karen would be charged with criminal mischief, reckless endangerment, and property destruction. In a situation where a natural disaster had everyone's nerves frayed to begin with, her actions were especially abhorrent. Over the following weeks, the floodwaters receded. Most of the community emerged unscathed, though a few homes suffered significant water damage. The city rescue teams lauded our volunteer efforts, and local media ran stories about how neighborly cooperation saved countless residents from peril. The sabotage angle also made the news, sensationalizing the HOA tyrant turned criminal. But for me and my neighbors, it wasn't just tabloid gossip. It was our reality, something we had lived through. Meanwhile, Karen languished behind bars, awaiting trial. Unable to post the high bail set by the judge due to the severity of her charges, her immediate future looked grim. The district attorney, fueled by local outrage, pursued the case aggressively. It came to light that Karen had harbored resentment ever since the volunteer effort began. She wanted exclusive authority over how the neighborhood was run, and she felt overshadowed by my expertise and the support the community offered me. In her twisted mindset, if she dismantled our rescue gear, she could prove that my solutions were unreliable. She believed that when a crisis truly hit, she would swoop in as the official HOA savior. The trial was swift. Witness after witness detailed her erratic attempts at control, her sabotage of the rescue boats, her tampering with sandbags. Security footage, the slash marks on the boats, even her own statements, caught on a neighbor's cell phone camera, painted an indisputable portrait of guilt. Karen's defense attorney tried to argue she'd had a mental breakdown due to the stress of the impending flood. But the jury was not swayed by excuses for such methodical destruction. The verdict, guilty on multiple felony counts. The judge handed down a sentence that reflected the seriousness of her crimes, several years in prison. Additionally, civil suits by neighbors whose property suffered damage from the compromised flood defenses piled on top of the criminal charges. The final blow came when the court ordered a hefty financial penalty, forcing Karen to forfeit her property to satisfy the lawsuits and restitution fees. In one last display of defiance, Karen flung insults at everyone in the courtroom as she was led away by bailiffs, still wearing that rigid, haughty expression. But her words meant nothing. The law had prevailed, and so had the collective will of a community united by adversity. In the months that followed, Rivercrest Landing slowly returned to a state of normalcy. The water subsided to its usual gentle flow. FEMA inspectors came and went, helping families file for assistance. The neighborhood roads were cleared of debris, and the volunteer group reorganized to store the salvageable boat equipment in a safer, more secure facility. We elected a new HOA board, one with a more balanced approach to governance. The towering figure of Karen's tyranny was gone, leaving a vacuum quickly filled by genuine collaboration and goodwill. Though some houses still bore the faint watermarks of the flood, and a few gardens had to be replanted, the overarching sense was one of relief and renewed unity. People had come together to face a challenge and to stand up against a toxic individual who'd nearly jeopardized them all. The price had been high, but the bond forged through that collective trial was strong. For me, personally, the experience reaffirmed something I'd come to believe during my maritime career. Adversity is a crucible that reveals true character. On the high seas, storms test the mettle of every sailor. In a suburban neighborhood, the threats may be quieter, but the danger can be just as real. Through it all, individuals must choose whether they will help or harm their fellow humans. As I took one last walk along the Willowbend River a few months after the flood, I saw families picnicking on the grassy bank, children playing tag on the same roads that had once been underwater. The damage was repaired, the tension gone. And Karen, well, Karen was behind bars, stripped of her authority, her property confiscated, her reign of terror ended. Standing there, the gentle sound of the river lapping at the shore, I felt an enormous sense of closure. The shadows that had loomed over Rivercrest Landing lifted. We had weathered the storm, both literal and figurative, and emerged stronger. In the end, the neighborhood Karen tried to dominate proved it could unify against a common threat, her. Some might say it was justice, or karma, or simply the inevitable consequence of her tyrannical ways. Whatever it was, I was grateful. Grateful that, despite everything she attempted, good people refused to be bullied or endangered. Grateful to have played a role in defending this place. And grateful to see that, sometimes, in the face of swelling waters and human malice, a community can stand firm and rise above it all.